Well, welcome to the second Atlantis session. This will go through an example application for Southeast Australia. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the very many people that have helped through the years for this particular model. This is probably a subset of the most important people, but there's literally been heaps of scientists that know the Southeast Australian system really well that have advised into this process at one point or another. But Tony Smith in particular deserves acknowledgement because he's led the process for quite a long time in seeing the value of ecosystem models and how they might inform fisheries management. So in sort of the fisheries world, they're looking for advice on what they can do to get stocks to sustainable levels, looking for strategic insights, looking for a way of pulling together information, identifying key bottlenecks or processes that need to be eased on the management side to make a sustainability easier to achieve, but equally what kind of processes on the ecological side can create problems that affect implementation, and to then set reference points with all of that in mind to make sure that management's reliable. And that's a place that Atlantis can play into. It can play into each one of those points and provide information as a part of a bigger set of information that the managers and decision makers then use to structure what they're going to do. So the Southeast fishery is what's called a multi-everything fishery. It's multi-species. It interacts with over 400 species across 3.4 million square kilometres. There's multiple different gear types, pretty much every kind of gear you can imagine, except artisanal. It is a commercial fishery, industrial fishery. It's subtropical to subpolar in environments, and in the early 2000s, it was also declining economically. Social perception was pretty poor, and many species were in a degraded or degrading state. So across the board, fishermen, managers, scientists, everybody appreciated that something had to be done. So they got together to rethink some management arrangements. So there'd already been a co-management structure to this fishery where the different groups all came together to talk through the management options and the scientific evidence before decisions were ultimately made by the managers and the department, or the commission as it's called, the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, which is a statutory non-political authority to make the decisions. And so they were looking for options as a group. They went through a two-stage process. One was a qualitative scenario and foresighting process, and the second stage was taking those ideas into Atlantis to see if a quantitative approach came to the same conclusions as the experts. They looked at quite a range of different management options, but they sort of fell into four general classes. So I just talk about the four main examples here, one of which was the status quo, basically to keep doing what they were doing. And that was a bit of like a reference point to compare potential improvements against. There was one around having quotas on everything. So taking the kind of top-down management approach, but to a wider set of species. At that time, it was about 34 species that were under quota management, but they wanted to go look at what happens if they took that much broader. Remembering there's 400 species, they probably weren't ever going to get to that level, but many of the species are rarely caught. So it was about whether they should just focus on the key target and what they call byproduct or secondary species that are still landed and sold. Then there was an approach around conservation-driven ideas put forward by the environmental NGOs where you close the vast majority of the fishery area and just open small areas in a rotating kind of design to see if that would be a solution. And then just for a bit of contrast, the scientists actually, in collaboration with a couple of the other stakeholders, put up an idea that was never meant to be taken overly seriously. It was just about if you took a completely different approach to anything that was currently imagined, where every aspect of the fishery was targeted in its own way. So gear restrictions for size-based considerations, spatial zoning to cover habitat, quotas for key target species, using maximum economic yield, which, to be fair, all of the ones involving quotas use maximum economic yield because that's the objective of Australian fisheries rather than purely sustainable yield. Take that very structured approach in integrated management just to see how it compared to these other approaches that were fairly heavily leaning on one kind of management or another. So the experts sat together. Between them, they had over 100 or even a couple of 100 years worth of experience in that particular fishery. They just weren't sort of generic Delphi experts on economics and environment. They were experts in that particular fishery. And they sat down and they drew up conceptual models of how the different parts of the fishery were connected, both in terms of species caught in the gears together, the different spatial areas, how they're influenced by the environment. They did most particularly, even if they didn't follow through on the interactions, they did actually sit down and go through a very structured process of saying how some particular indicators that they were really worried about, like the level of biomass of a species or the level of catch or the gross value of product, how that was related to other things in the system, such as the number of fish or the size of fish or environmental influences, so that they had a structured, repeatable process to when they did a foresight and said, okay, if we change this management lever, it influences fish size, which means that gross value of product will change in this way. So that you don't have to, so they had to take a very structured approach to the way that they did that, so that that they got repeatability time after time inside, basically kept themselves honest. So they didn't have inconsistencies in the way that they came together in each different scenario. So they were consistent scenario to scenario and logic to logic through the different scenarios. So once they'd done that, they came out with an idea of what they thought would be an effective management approach and where they thought they would fail. And then I repeated the same scenarios in Atlantis, but a lot slower. They did their whole exercise in about 6 weeks to 6 months, and I took 2.5 years. So that was one advantage of being qualitative. It didn't take nearly as long. But we defined the fisheries area across Southeast Australia. We defined what that depth structuring looked like, pulling out major canyons, pulling out major nursery areas and big bays, focusing on the shelf and into the slope areas, but also allowing for that fringing large offshore water as well, because there's seamounts throughout that area that they target for fishing. We brought into that then the environmental forcing from the Australia's ocean forecasting model called OFAM, which is very much like ROM. So we got temperature, salinity, oceanic exchange. These days, actually, when we use the same Southeast model, which has evolved over the last 20 years, we now can pull in downscaled climate forcing and things when we're looking at climate adaptation. But the idea is that you bring in temperature, salinity, pH or alkalinity, aragonite saturation if you want to do the climate stuff, a little bit of background oxygen, but the physical exchanges primarily. In terms of the food web structure, we had the key species of conservation concern, the key target species of the fishery. Then the whole rest of the web was represented in a functional group sense, where the size, feeding relationships, habitat use, and spatial structure of the species we used to define those groups. So in terms of the invertebrates, there were 21 biomass pool groups. So you can see that within the plankton, there was size structure based on both the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, and then large functional groups for most of the benthic invertebrates. And for key fish species, they were pulled out at at least a sort of basket level of royal red prawns, giant crab, lobsters, that kind of stuff. And then in terms of the conservation species, the seagrass and macroalgae were considered with some care. Much more detail, admittedly, went into the vertebrate groups, where the key focus of the management and other people were. We had 32 age-structured groups. Again, a large number pulled out to explicitly to species level or even to genetic stock level. So there were multiple genetic stocks for the tuna, particularly southern bluefin tuna and the tropical tunas. We had multiple stocks of flathead, redfish, ling, orange roughy, because there's a strong east-west split in those species. For many of the other species, they were done at functional group levels. There could be some depth structuring that, as with the demersal sharks. So you had deep water dogfish separate to your upper slope shelf, separate to your true shelf species. And then you had quite a number of species of conservation concern, though they were treated more at, again, in a functional group sense. So instead of going down to individual albatross and terns and gulls, it was seabirds in general and fur seals in general and dolphins in general, though orcas were actually pulled out at a species level because they have an explicit interaction with the fishery. They do depredation where they come and feed on the catch. The structure of those genetic structs that we talked about is the same as assumed in the stock assessment models, and it has that very strong east-west split because we have one set of currents that come across the south of Australia from west to east, hit Tasmania and then sort of go south, and then we have another set of currents that just round down the east coast of Australia, so that has that strong structuring in it. The way that what we also did was allow for multiple size at age. Atlantis doesn't use a fixed size at age structure. It's a realised growth based on what you eat. And so you can have phenotypic variation in that. And particularly when we start to look at really fine harvest control rules that are dependent on size structure, we allow for that phenotypic variation. So we have distributions at size at age rather than a specific size at age. Most models that you'll interact with Atlantis will have one size, realised size at age through time for everything at that age, but it is possible to have those smoother curves. In terms of how well the model performed, we looked at feeding and spatial distribution. So in terms of diets, on the red bars are the observed diet structures for particular I think this was a predatory shark species, if I remember correctly. And the blue was Atlantis. So you can see that, and the dark lines around the midpoint, they're the sort of the median responses. You can see that in many cases, Atlantis had the right general distribution of feeding interaction for a group, but in some cases it also got it very wrong. So for instance, lobster was way overrepresented in the Atlantis diets versus the realised diets. But it gives you a sense that Atlantis is largely getting it right. It gets the ontogenetic shifts. And in terms, of the target species, you can see that Atlantis's trajectories over a couple of different variations of how it was parameterized gets the same gross patterns as the assessments, which are the open dots. They certainly don't exactly match, but we don't have survey data, so we had to use the assessments as sort of our proxy to compare against. So again, it was realistic enough in the way that it was fitting that people could put some trust into the results. In terms of the fisheries, we looked at many métiers, where métier was defined based on the gear used, the species targeted, the port of origin or the home port of that particular set of vessels, the vessel size, and its behaviour. So how long were its trips, how long did it steam versus go fishing, which markets did it supply, so that you could have a look at all those different components. So in the end, we had 32 métiers. Some of them were represented in a very simple sense because they're just kind of like a background pressure on the fishery, particularly around recreation and diving and some of the state fisheries, so that work within 3 nautical mile jurisdiction or within the 12 nautical miles. And then you had the federally managed fisheries, which were the focus of the actual study. They have many, many different gears, as you can see, many different targeting practices, And these we represented with socio-economic drivers. So what was the market doing? What was the friendship network of the captains? Did the captains tend to show a lot of innovation, or did they tend to keep going to the same location after the same kinds of fish? How did that vary between different métiers? There was ones in the south feeding the Melbourne market. There was ones in the north feeding the Sydney market. So there's quite a good deal of structure, and that could vary through time too. So you had your initial métiers, and they could evolve through time as different species were targeted and stuff like that. In terms of the details, I just highlighted some of the parts of the SESF, but it was important to have that dynamic aspect to it, because quota trading and targeting and even the ports and where fishing is based has changed a lot through the history of the fishery, particularly through the development period from 100 years ago through to the 1980s, where it ramped up quite significantly and rapidly. But even in the last decade or so, there's been quite a good deal of shifting, in part because climate change. This is a climate change hotspot area. Currents have moved about 280 to 300 kilometres further south. There's more than 60 new species, for instance, in Tasmania. So there's a lot of change happening in the biophysical world that the fishermen are responding to. In terms of how well that fisheries part of the model worked, we had a training set through to the mid-1990s, and then it was prediction after that. And again, it does a pretty decent job. It's not nailing the exact year-to-year variation right on, but the general pattern is acceptable. And that's because while individual humans are hard to predict, the aggregate behaviour, once you've broken it down in this kind of functional group of fisheries, so to speak, that's what a métier is, you can get the general trends okay. And it was reproducing some of the secondary features. There's a typo there that I'll have to fix. Some of the secondary features of the fishery pretty well as well, such as port activity levels, and how they change through time in the fishery. In terms of those bigger sets of drivers, we included fuel prices, ice, land-based costs, insurance, wage structures. We had a simple model of market dynamics. We had a simple friendship network that influenced how you shared information and traded quota. All of this stuff can be turned on and off, but it was fairly elaborated here because I needed to do that to represent how the fishery actually worked, because economic drivers weren't the main driver for a whole bunch of the fishermen involved. We also had a representation of the management system, both within the fishery itself and the reporting at sea and the assessment process, but also the bigger context that sits within. So the marine planning scheme and the spatial structuring of that and how that influences the fishery. In terms of how the data flows in and out of the model, researchers and literature influence a lot of the biophysical part of the model. If we had more fisheries independent surveys, I'm sure that data would have got sucked in, but in reality that's not exactly how Australia's data is structured. So there's a lot of research and literature that flows in to Atlantis in the biophysical parts of these models. The state fisheries information informs a little bit of that biophysical, the state and federal fisheries. So AFMA stands for the Australian Fisheries Management Authority. You can see it's where most of the data comes from. There's a little bit of data flow from the state fisheries. It's a lot harder to get data out of there. Where it's available, particularly catch data, that does flow in. And then we get management information from the federal government departments about how they want to structure these fisheries and the management, and then economic data where it's available. So you can see it's a really broad set of data sources that flow into the different parts of the model. In terms of the output, there's quite a lot of different kinds of output considered out of a thing like Atlantis. So you've got catch composition, you've got the distribution. So that's the catch composition, I should say, is the breakdown of species by gear type or by métier, by month or even trip. We have tried to mimic shot-by-shot level catch, but we find the trip level catch is more representative. We've looked at spatial catch distributions, both in terms of the depth of where the catch is happening as well as the spatial distribution. We look at catch and effort. Where's the effort going? How's that changing through time? In terms, we can then compare what that kind of stuff looks at through different scenarios. We can look at the breakdown of discards. We can look at observations versus predictions, biomasses, age, structure, diets, habitat state, even right through the economic kind of things like gross value, revenue, profits, cost structures, right, including the breakdown of the management costs in terms of what's research, what's surveys, what's the assessment cost, what's the management structure cost, which to an Australian fisheries is fairly important because we're a cost recovery fishery. The licence fees have to cover the entire cost of fisheries management. We also created some fairly simple indices of human perception or happiness of the general community with the state of the fishery. And we followed some gross level ecosystem things like size structure of the fishery. Within each of these areas, there was also the capacity to go into more detail. So for instance, in the ecology side of things, we could look at different kinds of species, whether they were threatened, protected, what was their status versus the status of sharks versus the status of bycatch species, target species, habitat, and microfauna. But there was also some other indicators like pelagic and piscivorous, sort of actual structural function of stuff. Equally on top of the economic side of things, there was the breakdown of all those kind of indicators that I just mentioned before around profits and revenue and that kind of stuff. Now, the way that so we had that model that worked fairly well. We'd worked with managers and the other people in the co-management system for this fishery. So that's environmental NGOs, the fishermen themselves, recreational fishers. These days there's traditional owners as well. There wasn't at the time that this project first ran, but it's certainly a consideration now. There's broader community representatives, there's managers, policymakers, all those kind of people. And they defined the different scenarios as they had for the qualitative model, and then we played them out. Sitting through what those scenarios outcomes look like, on the left-hand side here we have what the experts thought was going to happen, and on the right-hand side we have what the model thought would happen. So for each one of these objectives, we lumped together all of the metrics that people wanted for those to represent those particular objectives. So for target species, it was like spawner biomass sizes and age structure. For the broader ecosystem, it was the health of habitat, species of conservation concern, the structural indices that were tracked in the model. For management efficiency, it was around costs of management. For the social side, it was the social perception, happiness, sort of the ease people have around the fishery. For the industry, it was broken up in a few different ways. There was the financial aspects of the industry. Were they making money? What was their profit, their revenue, the gross value of the catch? But there are also indices around their certainty. How comfortable did they feel that they understood the management and responded to it? That kind of stuff. So with those kind of lumpings of indicators in mind, this light colour here was one pessimistic version of the status quo, and the red colour was the more optimistic version of the status quo from the experts. And this was the model world. So the experts thought it wasn't doing real great, except maybe management efficiency. Whereas the model said it was actually even worse than they thought in terms of the status of the target species in the industry's capacity to make money, which came as a bit of a surprise to the economists when the fishermen actually agreed with Atlantis more than they agreed with the economic experts. And that was because in some of that record keeping, they hadn't actually been reflecting as much of the pain that they were in as was the true case. Now, in terms of quota management, the experts all thought that while it might not be popular socially, because it wasn't seen as too much of a change versus now, that it would actually deliver on getting the industry more economically on a firmer footing, that it'd see specifically an improvement in the target species biomass and into the broader ecosystem, whereas Atlantis was not nearly as impressed by putting quotas on everything. And that's because the fishermen, at least in the model world, could figure their way around those quotas by subsidising their catches effectively on secondary species that weren't under quota. So ultimately the system continued to degrade, the industry therefore wasn't making as much money, and the certainty year to year really fell off, even if the management cost structure was fine. So Atlantis was a lot more pessimistic about the outcome of the quota management system. For the conservation case, there was agreement that because it would close things down so hard that the target species and ecosystem would come back really strongly. And so for the amount of fishing the industry could do, it would get high catch per unit effort and thus profitability levels and be really socially acceptable. They didn't think it was necessarily a completely viable approach because it would really close down a lot of the fishery, but for the effect it would have, it would be quite positive. Atlantis tended to play up more of the fact that actually the industry wouldn't be economically viable because it couldn't cover its base costs. So that was something the experts had in the back of their mind, but they hadn't expressed it to the same degree in the written document. So Atlantis really pushed home that that was going to be something that really undermined the effectiveness of this particular case. And actually, socially, it didn't help as much as perhaps was anticipated because of this economic hurt that was happening in the system as well. Now, in terms of that integrated management approach, interestingly, in this case, the experts and Atlantis both thought it would be a good all-round performer. It might not be the single best in any one of the dimensions. There was always just per objective, you could always find another scenario that outperformed just for that one objective. But across the board, this objective was, say, second in every case. So whereas any other scenario was only one at the top for one thing and then really low for the others, and so was only delivering to one objective, this particular scenario delivered across the board. It did come with a high transition cost of getting it in place, but if you could do that, it looked like it would work well, and both their qualitative and the quantitative model agreed. Now, the interesting thing was when this was first put up, it was called blue skies, which in Australia means you're kind of just out there imagining things. You don't think it's ever really going to happen. By the time that the qualitative process had run its course, the co-management group really liked this idea and were really excited about it. And the fisheries managers, but more importantly, the fishermen and the ENGOs got together and went to government and said, we want to see this, but we'll need help to get over that hurdle. Atlantis came along a bit later and said, yeah, we think you're about right. There's some devil in the detail. The experts miss sometimes where there was a lot more uncertainty around the trajectory of a particular species than you'd like. But in the main, Atlantis agreed. And in fact, about 85% of the times, Atlantis and the experts agreed. In about 14% of the time, Atlantis was a lot more uncertain, but generally in the same direction as the experts. And it was only 1% to 2% where Atlantis said, no, you got it completely wrong. The trajectory is opposite because of some trophic interactions or spatial interactions you hadn't thought about. So the two were on a strong agreement across the outcomes, particularly for this particular scenario. And that had a really big outcome for the fishery that I'll talk about in a second. But basically, if we think about these results, what was happening was that if you just take a very disciplinary-based approach, that top-down control looked like it would perform really well. It wasn't until you started to think about the broader implications that you really needed to see the fact that, yes, to deal with all of those objectives and the different parts of the ecosystem that you're worried about, you really do need to pull in this more balanced and integrated approach to management. And this, we're starting to see similarly in the coastal zone, the same kind of thing. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some strong trade-offs behind all this. There were. So you couldn't get conservation and economics to both be at the highest level at the same time. There is a bit of a trade-off in this case between the two. There's also a trade-off between short-term costs versus the long-term payoff. There was quite a large transitional cost in getting any significant management outcome. There were also management costs. So in terms of you have to put money in to do the compliance enforcement. And if you allow a race to fish because you haven't got very strong management and there's a high IUU or not strong enforcement, that has its own costs in the form of economic collapse. So there's many different points where those trade-offs come in, and even the decision to do nothing, in effect, has its own management cost. If you could move to the integrated management, though, you could see increased profit and reduced risk long term, and it's that message that won ultimately the decision makers over. So there are quite a number of management strategy implications that were considered under this: how to get unfished reference areas, how to get reference points, what was the effect of the spatial management options? Could you trade off spatial management for quotas, or did you need both? The fact that ultimately there was no single solution, that you needed the integration, that there was high behavioural uncertainty and you needed to bring that in. So what they call implementation error. The fishermen wouldn't always do what you expected, and you had to take that into account. You couldn't just assume that they would do as they're told and you'd get the right outcome. You had to allow for the strong trade-offs, and even between different sectors. Not all sectors benefited, even in the integrated one. There were some sectors that had a much stronger payoff and outcome than other sectors, particularly the trawl sector often did a lot better, and large trawl operators often did a lot better than some of the smaller operators. So into doing all that, you did have to have a long discussion about where you wanted to get to and what were considered acceptable impacts, because you can't have a fish system that has no impact. As much as we'd love to do that, you're restructuring the system by putting new stress on it. So it had to be a long-term conversation. So all of that information came together, the excitement around both the qualitative results and the quantitative backing up of that information, an understanding of what the costs were going to be short-term versus long-term, all of that information coming together, but highlighting that ultimately it would put things on a more stable footing, make it more resilient and reduce risks, led to a pretty significant outcome. So the management authority decided to put its efforts behind it, and they went to the minister. The minister said that he was interested, but he had to see a really big payoff because there was a lot of money involved. So in collaboration with the Treasurer of Australia at the time, they said they'd do it, but they had to restructure every single Australian fishery in the sense that the idea around integrated management had to become the basis of how you do all federal fisheries management in Australia. And they did it. They transitioned within a 2-year period all of the fisheries of Australia onto that kind of footing. So that was to the cost of 220 million Australian dollars to do all of the fisheries. They had a major buyout of effort across the fisheries, but it was a really big step forward. And a decade later, the fishery is on a more sustainable footing. It is more financially viable. Given everything that's happened, there's now no overfishing happening in Australia. That's not to say there's not some overfished stocks that are still recovering from the past. There's still quite a number of species that are struggling with stock status and recovery, but the whole basis of the fishery is in a much better state. And in terms of the science, MSC testing, and particularly using ecosystem models, is now considered standard practice for the federal fisheries. And when they're thinking about new ideas, they actually approach ecosystem modelers to play out those ideas in the model. So not just in Southeast Australia, but around Australia for federal waters now. There's a close relationship between modelers and fishery scientists because they can see the value of doing that. It takes a lot to keep that relationship going and to make sure the models are up to date and doing the best they can, but it has had a pretty big outcome. Now, interestingly, it's also been far enough into the future that we can go back and see how well the model predicted. So that should actually say to 2017 because I've updated the plot from 2007. So basically the dots are the observed effort levels and the coloured lines are from the different scenarios. Now, what happened in reality was in the first few years out to 2005, so the model was conditioned on history to 2000 and then let run forward under the different scenarios. From 2000, about 2005, 2007, the world was actually running under scenario 3, so intensive quota management compared to what it was in 2000. So more and more species were coming under quota management. So it was about scenario 3. Then in 2007, 6-7, there was a big buyout. And over half of the effort was taken out, much as Atlantis had predicted would happen if you moved to scenario 10, which was kind of a pragmatic mix of scenario 3 and 4, and is as close to what happened in reality as any of the scenarios I tested back then. And you can see that Atlantis got even that level of effort right. So that was a huge surprise to me. I didn't expect it to have worked that well. But not only did it get those rough effort levels about correct, it actually foresaw that there'd be a mixed ability of different species to recover. Now, that's in part because of economic dynamics by the fleet members themselves, in part because there's so fewer vessels, it's hard to fulfill quota over the same area, but also because biologically some of the species aren't recovering, and that's because of trophic interactions, but also because of climate. And so it is still a very complicated area, but in the main, Atlantis does well. And this is one area that we probably underplay in all ecosystem models, is to go back and see how well we did. The system might not have played out exactly as we would have expected in any one of the scenarios, but how well do we do with our predictions? And without going back and checking in that way, we're not really ever going to progress. But generally, Atlantis has been really useful in this fishery, and it took a long time to get the confidence behind it, and also to tamper that confidence and don't oversell it when the managers got excited. But there is now a strong relationship where you can use the model with its internal logic to test out the logic of the different ideas of the management strategy. So that's just an example of how you might use it. Okay, thank you. That's it for this particular session, and we can talk through more examples in a second in the question and answer session. Thanks. Bye.